Disclaimer: the information and education material contained herein is meant to promote the general understanding and dialogue of GANS processing. Such information is not meant or intended to serve as a substitute for a healthcare professional's clinical training, experience, or judgment. For patients and individuals, such information is not to be a substitute for professional medical, therapeutic, or healthcare advice or counseling. For medical issues or concerns, including decisions about medications and other treatments, readers, viewers, listeners should always consult their physician or, in serious cases, seek immediate assistance from emergency personnel. Prescription information, procedures, and use of medical devices information should be undertaken only by properly trained and certified medical personnel. We specifically disclaim any warranties, express or implied, including implied warranties of merchantability or fitness for a particular purpose. Such information is provided, as is, and is believed to be accurate at the time of its publishing, but it is the viewer's job to evaluate the accuracy of any information found in this presentation. Every case presented is of their own experience, applied by themselves for themselves, and it applies to their case only. Every person experiencing health problems should seek professional medical advice and consult their course of treatment with a doctor. The processes of plasma balancing described herein are a natural process which supports the body but does not replace medical advice or therapies one is already subject to.
Thank you all for joining the Kish American Knowledge Team. As we discuss with the unconditional transmission of energy coming from the sun, we all have the capability of absorbing the energy that we want to do so. And we all have the capability of using that energy in our own way. So each of us has that choice. So some of us has gone to football games, some of us has gone to soccer games, some of us are gardening, and some of us are at this meeting. And each of us is deciding on what is important to our lives and what we can do. So I want to thank you all for being here, because we are on the verge of doing something quite significant, and you're all part of that process. So, and we are trying to expand the knowledge in a way that each of us has that capability within our own ability to go forward. This is the Kesh Foundation Spaceship Institute Teachings on Plasma Science. We are dealing with the basic GANS tech. Today's topic is polyatomic. I'm Alexander from Canada. It is September the 14th, 2025. This is part of the Kesh Foundation North America Plasma Education Series. As we have spoken before, we are trying to condense the knowledge in such a manner that the mature knowledge seekers can move forward, and the new knowledge seekers can join in, and they can see the path how we've gotten here. Polyatomic is an interesting subject. We've wanted to address that for quite a while, because it means that there are different types of atomic versions. And why would that not be true? I mean, we all know what a car is, and many of us own one or two, and they all have different features. Everything from the power, the type of motor, to the color. And so there's a variety. Well, that's what is happening in the universal order of creation of matters. We have variety, and lots of variety, but it all comes together as described in book number 1 by Marian Tavakoli Kesh. They're coming together of the matter, the dark matter, and the antimatter. So these are 3 different energy fields coming together from 3 different dimensions, coming together to create the one dimension. And at that point, we call it matter. And this is what we're familiar with. And then, of course, when the sun comes up, it brings us to light, which means it's coming to our field. But it also means it's coming from another field. So in book number 2, when we're talking about the structure of the light, we have to understand that it's coming to and coming from. And in that way, we see that light, and then of course we see where it's coming from, and then the way we see it is also coming to and from. So it means it's a two-way street, and this becomes an important part of the discussion today. In book number 3, The Origin of the Universe, exemplifies this, illustrates this, in other words. We have the one field splitting into two fields. Please remember that the opposite is true, that the two fields can converge into the one field. So this is the process of the origin of the universe. Since we are part of the universe, we are part of the same process. This is the thing that we have to understand. So as we are divergent in terms of, let's say, approximately 8 billion people on this planet, we are on one planet. And so for 395 weeks, Yvir Kremen and the Universal Council have bringing forward the one planet, one nation, one race for justice and world peace. And this is very important because this is what's lacking on this planet, justice and world peace. And it's not just for this planet, as we say, it's part of the universe. So our need is the same as the universal need. And it appears that our need is greater. And if our need is greater and we are part of the universe, then just by extension, the universe needs this as well, because we're lagging behind. So where exactly is that lagging? And so we find that because we're lagging, we need these commandments to tell us how to live, because we're not clever enough or smart enough to know how to live. So we have to be told. And there are an additional commandments for a total of 24 commandments. And when I say it's my favorite commandment, thou shalt not lie, the reason for that is because it seems so innocuous, and yet it's fundamental to the maladies of our society, because that lying leads to cheating, stealing, and eventually into killing. And basically, it's a kind of destruction that is not conducive to the process of creation. We have to understand that in the process of creation, destruction is creation as well. You can create destruction. We call it decay, and that is a more graceful kind of destruction. But when that destruction is specifically for the purposes of sabotaging the creation, well, that's what we're talking about. That is the missing understanding that we have, and this is one of the things that is lacking and contributing to our lacking. So this stems from the misunderstanding of the plasma rule. We believe the higher strength eats the weaker strength, and so we have conducted our lives accordingly. And we've been taught to do that. We've been taught very early and repeatedly and reinforced. But the plasma rule, the higher strength feeds the weaker strength. And we have to understand that this is very normal, because when we look at the relationship of the size of the sun compared to the size of the earth, definitely the sun is of a higher strength. And so the coming together of these energies are not a conflict point, but a binding zone. But we seem to interpret this binding zone as a point of conflict, because, when two tribes come together, then you have a war, and only one can survive. Or maybe there are other alternatives. But when we see the two fields coming together for discussion purposes, there is a manifestation field. We call it inertia. And because it's a manifestation field, it would be more dense. How much more dense? Well, it all depends on where in the chain of coming together we're talking about. So the lowest energy state is the physical energy state. And this we're very familiar with. And of course, that really contributes to our own density. That's why we are so focused on these energy binding needs. And they should be for self-serving purposes because no one loves you more than yourself. No one. So no one knows what you need more than you do. But do we admit what we need? That becomes a key point. Some of us feel invincible. Some of us feel we don't need anything at all. But what we do need is to be able to be part of the creation. We need to be able to contribute. And when we're lacking in that, we look around and see, where am I going to get my self-serving energy? Oh, why don't I steal it from someone else who likewise need that self-serving energy binding? And so what does that do? It either creates a backlash or it creates a domino effect. Either way, it has over the years become our dominant way of operating in our society. And so that's why we talk about this angular density, where we are called the fallen angels, because it implies falling towards density, which means there's increased density, increased pressure, increased gravity, and of course becomes an increased dependence on the Earth space feeding. So we found that this pressure that comes together, last week we talked about the GANS popcorn and how it comes from the intensity within. But if we understand that this angular density is part of the angular momentum and it is conserved, that means if the energy is moving from one place to another, then something is increasing energy and something is reducing energy, and there is a balance. So when we talk about loosh and loosh harvesting, we see that that is a theft of energy, the loosh being that energy. And so many have a single-minded intention, and enough of us have accepted that, that becomes the hive mind intention, where we don't just want to create honey, but we want to steal your honey. And the truth is always reflected by the true intention. And that intention comes from within. And within our body bag, if you will, our skin, which is our body, we have GANS. And GANS has this emotional affinity. And so this is one of the reasons it affects us. So this notion of falling has a very negative connotation. But the thing is that falling is like a shower. And this week we were showered in gold. And we've come to that tipping point where we are crossing that memory threshold. So what we have to understand is that there isn't just a lifetime memory, but there's a long-term memory. And the freedom is what connects you to this memory. So we're talking about lifelong memory, historic memory, ancestral memory, and universal memory. These are all part and parcels of our memory. So it's more than what we experience. So what we're experiencing is a shortfall in vitality when we have to supplement it and facilitate the uplifting of the emotional and physical vitality. This is one of the reasons we are working from a position of lacking what we want, lacking what we need. And as a result of that pursuit, then we become even more, shall we say, dominating in our approach. And that domination turns into greed, so that it appears that we're never lacking. But the truth of the matter is, there's always a give and take. And so the more you give, the more you receive, unless there are intermediaries who are stealing. And if we're not skillful enough in terms of the receiving and in terms of our giving, then we have a tendency to leak. And that's leaking is part of our lacking. And the abundance is on the transmutation highway because the universe gives unconditionally. So we're still on the transmission highway, which is the lowest level. And in the atomic structure, we call that the carbon 12. We are organic. And so that means we are created from carbon, and the carbon 12 being the lowest energy, being the physical energy. When we get to the transition of the carbon 14, we are already dealing with isotopes. And then when we move to the carbon 16, it's a different kind of isotope, but it's of a higher energy state. And so we can graduate from energy state to energy state. But when we say the graduation, we seem to refer as if it's a some kind of superiority. It's not really. We all have this ability to transcend these various energy states. We just seem to be focused on the lowest one. And so our life is dominated by that. And this came to light when we had the pandemic because we created the cups of life. And they were not the cups of the pandemic because what they were is the nanocoding process of the monatomic science, which enhanced our inner space. In that inner space, we have an emotional strength and a physical strength. And so we realized that we could create a GANS. And that's what we're talking about today. We're talking about the GANSs and how this technology has changed our viewpoint because it's a representation of a radiance manifestation. What I mean by that, we had a physical cup of life and we created a CO2 GANS, a calcium, zinc, copper GANS, water GANS, an amino acid GANS. And did we know that we could do all these things? And we also created a gold GANS. And as I say, this week we were showered with the energy that produced this gold GANS. Well, if you're being showered with this, that means it's not coming from within, it's coming from without, as would be reasonable when we start to introduce the cup of the soul, because the emotional cup has a magnetical gravitational relationship and develops a soul at its core. The physical cup likewise has a magnetical gravitational relationship and develops a soul at its core. The cup of soul has a magnetical gravitational relationship and develops a soul at its core. But collectively, the cup of the soul, the cup of the emotion, and the cup of the physicality has a magnetical gravitational relationship and the soul at its core. And that is a representation of all three. So the containment of this field includes all the members I've just described. So when you're looking at this field, you cannot isolate a component and say, well, that's what that is, and that's what that is. What you can do is understand that the magnetical force fields are being emitted. All of the magnetical force fields are being emitted, and you can choose what you wish to absorb. And it's easy to choose. You choose what you need because it's being given unconditionally. So you choose conditionally because that's based on what you need. But if you have what you need, you won't get any more. That's the way the universe works. So we have the two hemispheres of the brain operating the same way. We have the copper GANS and the zinc GANS, which represent the physicality and the emotional strength. And then the connection to the universe, the carbogen. So we have these three dimensions, and we put them together, and we get a sum total of three. But the thing is, we don't just have a brain that just sits there. we have a body that has arms and hands and can do things. And so we have more than three. And then we don't just end up with a body with no brain. So therefore, we still have the original three dimensions and we have the product. And so we see that we are operating in two different field strengths. One is plasmatic and one is physical. And so this is the difference. We try and like things in straight lines. We've been taught the Euclidean geometry, but that's not the way life works. We have compromise on how we incorporate the curves of the universe into our straight lines. Well, the Riemannian geometry actually does that. It shows us how we can incorporate the curves of life. Why are there curves? Because there's a giving and a taking. Now, there's a transition from the giving to the taking. So, like a race car that's coming to a corner, you have to slow down as you come in and you have to speed up as you go out to navigate around that corner. So at some point in time, the energy coming in and the energy going out is zero. But the energy coming in and the energy going out is always in balance. So there's a transition. And that's what happens as we go around the curve. So let's remember that transition, because that's what we're going to talk about today, because we're talking about polyatomic. So when we're thinking in straight lines, we have to realize that those straight lines are really connecting different energy levels. And in the plasma science, these levels are all measured by orders of magnitude, which means 10 times. So when we're looking at the difference between mega and giga, that's 3 orders of magnitude. That's 1,000 times. When we're looking at the difference between micro and nano, that's 3 orders of magnitude, also 1,000 times. One is 1,000 times larger, one is 1,000 times smaller. And those are not the only 2 points to link. So there are multiple points. And so these become multiple turning points, because as one moves, the other has to compensate. And so we kind of assume that all of this is in the physicality. Well, we are talking about energy fields that are operating at many, many different orders of magnitude. So what is really important is the magnetical gravitational relationship, or what we call the MAGRAV condition. In other words, the destination point on one side has to have a magnetical gravitational relationship. The destination on the other side has to have a magnetical gravitational relationship. The MAGRAV on one side then becomes arbitrarily magnetical, and the MAGRAV on the other side becomes arbitrarily gravitational. So however we circumnavigate these multiple turning points, there's always a balance, a MAGRAV balance. So the balance of the MAGRAV on one side with the balance of the MAGRAV on the other side becomes a new inertia point of a MAGRAV manifestation, regardless of whether it's in physicality or in a plasma state. So our thinking has to go beyond the linear and take into consideration the rest of the universe and understand how it engages with that. So we have to think outside the box. And lo and behold, we are now in the what we call the Beyond the Beijing watershed, where we demonstrated on May the 10th how we could produce gold. And we did this with the production of GANSs. And that GANS was manifest into a black powder. And it wasn't until we touched it that it became gold. So what we saw was that we were able to create a field, an inertia field, from two rotating GANSes. And then that inertia field maintained a certain energy level. In order to move it off of that, we had to engage with another bag of GANS. You with the magic finger. And as soon as you touched it, that created a new inertia field, and that converted to gold. And if we can consolidate these efforts and ramp up the scale and change the gradient, we can create gold by the tons. So we know that men are miners, but they're not the only gold diggers. This is not an exclusive thing. It's for everyone. And this week we were showered with gold. And why is that so important? Because there's a certain characteristic about the gold in what it can contain in terms of energy and how we process this energy. So what we're dominating in terms of our observation is the physical gravitational matter plasma, because we can touch it and see it. Well, we have to recognize that when we get showered with this energy, that is a plasmatic matter state. We can't touch it or see it, but it is part of the matter plasma because it's a neighbor to the physicality. We carry that neighbor with us all the time. And it is from this point of view that we see the universe. This point of view is feedback. And so we are feedback dominant. We have to recognize that there is a plasma dimension that is actually doing that showering. We're just the receiver of that showering. So when we originally talked about the nano alignment, we found that we were dealing with a copper wire and we nano-coated it, and that nano-coating was carbon. Strange. How do you get carbon from a copper wire? Where did that carbon come from? So obviously it came from a field. And we know that because we created a field alignment by making this nano alignment. And we measured the carbon, and it was of a diamond material. So that was a coming together of the coating of the copper wires. And then we went to a superconducting level of that wire where the resistance was eliminated. So we went from a balanced field of a copper wire in its atomic structure, and we created nanocoating, which made it now a superconductor. And so it follows the rules of MAGRAV energy transfers, where you have the balance on one side as the balance is on the other side. So we were talking about an atomic state, then we went to the nano state, and we have various strengths because those strengths were changed by the number of layers of the nanocoating that we had. And so we had as many as 30 to 40,000 layers in those particular initial examples that we had in say around 2015. But now we are even making that more dense. But then we have another product, which was the GANS coating. And then that GANS we put on top of the nano solid, but it had different attributes. And then we found that there was an intermediate state between the nano and the GANS, and it was the pico state. And so the pico coating sat in the gaps of the nano coating. And an interesting thing happened to the pico. It seemed to be more than just a point. In fact, it was very pointy. There were a lot of points on it. It almost looked like it exploded like a popcorn. And so we find that there was an intermediate state with the nanocoating, which we called it monatomic, and then we had the pico popcorn, which transformed into the GANS popcorn. And the GANS was of a much larger size. So the pico was 3 orders of magnitude smaller than the nano, but the GANS was on the other side much larger. And so we called it the GANS freakout, if you will, because we find that the negative charges were on the periphery, because that was the magnetical aspect of the GANS. But it wasn't one point, it was many, many points. And so this created field forces. And then on the inside, complementary positive charges. These are part of the gravitational, the gas in the center. And so there was a gas in the center that exploded and created this GANS. And so we see a difference in the appearance. So what exactly happened here? Well, so more energy was contained within the GANS. And in order to accommodate it, we had to have more magnetical points and more gravitational points to compensate. So we still had the Magrav balance. But the thing about the GANS particles is that they are a gas as a nanosolid. And they were not monatomic, they were monomolecular. And they had a higher surface to volume ratio in terms of the points, because that susceptibility now had 60 faces. And each of these faces had increased energy by orders of magnitude. And so this represented the plasmatic force fields of attraction and repulsion, because there was a magnetical and a gravitational containment field, and all the energy was inside. So it was like an icosahedron. And if you look at the shape of it, it's almost like a soccer ball. So much bigger than the nanoparticles, and they definitely carry the charge as well, because of its alignment, or shall we say non-alignment, because it was molecular. So molecular in terminology comes from the Latin molecula, which is a tiny mass. So how tiny is it? Well, it's not as tiny as a pico, but it is still tiny. So molecular means the combination of two. How is that different from alloy? Well, the meaning of the term alloy is a substance formed from the combination of two or more metals. So it specifically refers to metals, and it can also be formed from combinations of metals and other elements. So like oxides or something. And the properties exhibited by alloys are often quite different from the properties of their individual components. Yes, they certainly change the nature of the product. Well, if we go back to atomic, let's remember the word atomic is derived from the ancient Greek adjective atomos, meaning uncuttable or indivisible. Well, when we coined that phrase, we didn't talk about electrons and protons, which obviously constitute part of the atom. But what is different between atomic and monatomic? So a molecule that is composed of just one atom and lacking any covalent bonds. So the noble gases like helium, neon, argon, kryptonite, xenon, and radon are all monatomic, whereas most other gases are at least diatomic. Oh my. Well, we also refer to monatomic as the nanocoating on the copper wire. So what it means is that in order to be in existence, it has to have a magnetical gravitational relationship. And so a molecule that is just composed of one atom is really atomic. And to differentiate, we call it monatomic when it has the two aspects of these fields coming together. So it's maintaining its existence, but it's doing that individually. A lot of us like to do that. We want to get away from the big city and just live alone. We don't want to be bothered by anybody. But diatomic is another phrase. And a diatomic element is an element that is never found by itself in nature. It is always bonded to another like atom. So my thinking is atoms that link up would be diatomic. So let's say like a copper wire would have the atoms linking up, but that's not what diatomic means. So to help us remember some of the 7 elements that are diatomic on the periodic table of elements, as a clever phrase, he never falls on ice cream buns. And so the first letter of each word refers to hydrogen, nitrogen, fluorine, oxygen, iodine, chlorine, and bromine. And there you go. So what does that mean? Well, it means that each one comes in pairs. So this is different. So when we talk about the atomic chains, so if we're looking at a copper wire, each atom is copper and they're linked up. But when we nanocoated them, then we created new atoms, but they weren't linked up. They were kind of like on a string, seemed to be attached, but there was no attachment there. And so this was the beginning of the liberation of man, where we went from being chained to being unchained. What do we mean by that? Well, when we're physically dominant, we're at the atomic stage. And if we want to move towards the plasmatic dominant, then we have to go to a higher energy state. That first level was the monatomic state of the nanocoating. Well, how is that different from polyatomic, which is what we want to talk about today? Because in chemistry, this describes something composed of many atoms, mostly commonly referred to as a polyatomic ion, which is a covalently bonded group of 2 or more atoms that carries a net electric charge. So these charge units, such as, by example, the ammonium ion, which is NH4+, or the hydroxide ion, which is oxygen hydrogen minus. And they function as a single entity within the compounds and are a fundamental concept in chemical bonding and nomenclature. So the opposite charges attract. So the plus will attract to the minus. And so that is the fundamental concept. But since it's polyatomic, it means that we're not talking about 2 atoms or any 2 atoms. We are talking about 2 different atoms. So if you have a copper atom with another copper atom and they continue to link up in a chain, you would end up with a copper wire. But when you have different atoms coming together, then you change that structure, and that becomes polyatomic. So a polyatomic ion is a charged chemical species composed of 2 or more atoms covalently bonded together and acts as a single unit. And because it contains more than one atom and has an overall electric charge, either positive or negative, is referred to as polyatomic, meaning many atoms, and is considered an ion. Well, this is interesting. So there are polyatomic molecules, and some examples are like glucose, carbon dioxide. Oh, we're familiar with carbon dioxide. Sulfur dioxide, sulfur tetrafluoride, hexane, propane, sulfuric acid, nitric acid. So we see that these are molecules because they have different atomic structures that combine together, and hence we call them polyatomic. So if we were looking at the difference between the atomic and the polyatomic, then we're saying, well, the monatomic was singular atoms of the same species, but polyatomic is atoms involving more than one species. And somehow they bond together with covalent bonds. And the reason they bond together is because they are a combination of positive and negative charges. So if we look at these polyatomic chains, if we look at the top row, we have to say that one is, say, gravitational and one is magnetical, and they alternate. So opposite poles attract. But if we look at the middle row, we can introduce another concept. So we can say that between the blue and the red is a gradient, and resting in between that gradient is a green one. And then on the other side, between the blue and the red, is another gradient, and resting in between is another green one. We don't know what it is. And we could go into the third row, and now we could introduce another atom. So we could have a blue and a red providing a gradient, and another atom resting in between. And then likewise on the other side. So we see this progression where each one is a polyatomic chain, but it doesn't specific. It is just two or more. And how many more? Well, it doesn't matter. When we look at alpha-linolenic acid, what we call the omega-369, we see a long chain of carbons and hydrogens. And then we see the carboxyl chain on one side, which is water soluble, and the methyl on the other side, which is oil soluble. And then we see through the bending how we can create water and how we can create oxygen. And this is all done by charge. So we find that essential fatty acids are slightly alkaline, but they are all linked up as polyatomic structures. And so the chain itself, all of the poles repel each other because all the poles are facing the same way. But we have other polyatomic examples. We call them body-centered tetrahedrons, like organs of the body, the endocrine system, methane, Earth's crust. There's ammonium again, hemoglobin, chlorophyll, or phosphate. And then our favorite, carbogen, which is CO4, carbon and 4 oxygens. Our MAGRAV reactors work this way. And then we can go to the next level, which is face-centered tetrahedrons. So we still have the points, and then we still have the center. And so we find that when we talked about polyatomic, we had a different terminology. We called it diatomic, which meant like hydrogen, as an example, which meant it always comes in pairs. And then lo and behold, not only does it come with the possibility of having the like poles repelling, but by flipping the poles, we can have opposite poles attracting. But the result is the same because the emission poles balance the absorption poles. So the structure appears to be the same, but it is not the same, and it has a different effect. So we see the basic hydrogen as coming from the source, but then that source is a field, and then there's a connection to another field, and we use the carbon-14 to do that. And when we step up to the next level, which we were talking about the GANS popcorn, we have another connection to the universe, which is carbon-60. And, you know, we haven't graduated to understanding the unicos or the creator either at this point. We're still, you know, learning the basic things like polyatomic GANS. So it, in a way, is a molecule because a molecule is two separate atoms coming together. But what we did in the structure to produce the carbon dioxide, we brought in the copper, nanocoated copper that is, plus zinc, plus water, plus salt, and we came up with carbon dioxide GANS. When we substituted the nanocoated copper for the nanocoated zinc, we came up with zinc oxide. And instead of the zinc, if we did copper with a nanocoated copper and added water and salt, we ended up with a copper oxide. And so what we find is that these GANSes are all polyatomic. In this example, we brought in two atomic structures, but interestingly enough, with the zinc, we brought in two oxygens, and with the carbon, we brought in two oxygens. So it's more than just two atoms. And so all of this is represented in our, what we call susceptibility, because something is always something. Nothing is nothing. Nothing doesn't exist. Something is always something as opposed to being something else. And so we not only see that the GANS, as it explodes and becomes popcorn, but we can actually create a hole in the GANS. And in order to do that, we find that the GANS itself creates a rotating field, and so there's a hole in the middle of it. And what we found from the cups of life is that there's a soul in that hole. And so we've created the same representation. So in review, there's a magnetical aspect and a gravitational aspect and a soul. But there's a charge involved. And so we talked about this polar energy, the emission, we call that magnetical. And there's the absorption, we call that gravitational. And we can affect the charge through the rotation, the speed, and the strength. And also we can affect the direction. So what do we mean by that? Well, it's a two-way street. So the magnetical is the dominant emission, and the absorption is the subordinate gravitational. But the structure is gravitational, and that is the dominant. And the field is magnetical, and that is the subordinate. And so there's a balance, and this is what we're talking about. So there's a balance between the vertical polar energy and there's a balance between the rotational energy. And so these are the multiple turning points that we have to take into consideration. And lo and behold, you look at the Grand Central Earth Station, and we have all of these GANSes, and they're all different and all different masses, and they come with all different combinations. But fundamentally, eventually, they all produce elements. So when we look at the periodic table of elements, we can see all the individual elements on this earth. But we are complex. So in other words, we're not elemental and we're not molecules. We are polyatomic. And the earth itself is polyatomic because the combination of all the atoms on the earth are all the elements in the periodic table of elements. So let's understand, when we talk about the tetrahedrons, we're talking about star formation. And when we look at the star core component, it's made exactly the same way as the cup of life. So it has a magnetical field and a gravitational field. Well, that balance is a gradient charge. We're not saying what the charge is. We're not saying how strong it is. There's just a gradient. And that gradient constitutes a charge. And so the magnetical is negative and the gravitational is positive. So now, if the one side, the magnetical, is a balance of a magnetical gravitational point, that becomes the magnetical gradient charge. And if the other side is a balance of the magnetical gravitational charge, it becomes a gravitational gradient charge. So when we take into account the relationship between one and the other, one must be weaker than the other. So the gravitational is stronger than the magnetical. So the gravitation gives to the magnetical. From the magnetical, it comes back to feed the gravitational because it's a two-way street. Well, that seems to be a very self-serving method. But interestingly enough, when we get to the GANS point, we find that the GANS becomes contained within this magnetical gravitational field and hence becomes more gravitational. And so this gives us another point of view from the face-centered tetrahedron. So if we look at the relationship between two stars, and we look at this based on polarity alone, we have 2 points of view. So one has a magnetical gravitational relationship, that becomes the magnetical gradient charge. And the other has the opposite, which becomes the gravitational gradient charge. So now if you look at the totality of this picture, there's a magnetical and a gravitational relationship. So the two work as one. And then you have that GANS inertia point where we have the GANS containment. So now you have another gravitational gradient charge, which increases the overall field strength. So what we're concerned with is this arbitrary point of view where everything is coming together. And don't never mind everything else because those are just terminal ends. They're just loose ends. But what are they connected to? Because everything is connected. So either it's connected as a chain link or it's connected as a covalent bond, isn't it? So when we look at the total picture, the star core inertia point becomes that gravitational inertia point, and it becomes a manifestation with different turning points, because one point of view, the gravitational magnetical relationship, is variable, and it is offset and balanced by the magnetical gravitational relationship of the other point of view because of the laws of conservation of energy. And so we find that we can change these points of view through the susceptibility to be able to increase or decrease the energy field. We can do that with the magnetical gradient charge, or we can conversely susceptibility decrease or increase also. And that would be the gravitational gradient charge. We would still have that gravitational inertia point, but it certainly would be different. So we're just talking conceptually where we bring two stars together, but that's all in a self-contained environment. But that's not the way things work. We have to introduce the concept of duality. So we're going to extend this to 2 points where two things work together in tandem, like a partnership. And we call this the concept of the twinity. And so each one maintains its own Magrav condition, and then each one then is connected to something else. We haven't specified what that is, but rest assured that it has to be connected, because you cannot extricate yourself from the universe. You're part and parcel of that universe, regardless of what your status is. So now we're talking about the ray motion, which is creation. So the creation on the one hand, which is a balance between the natural creation and the decay, is offset by the balance on the other side, which is the balance between the natural creation and natural decay. And so there is a bond between that. And when we can't specify it and we don't understand it, then we just fudge our knowledge and say, well, there's something there that's holding everything together, and let's pray that it all stays together. But it is not there without any kind of intention or connection. There always is a connection, and it is ever changing. And so that is what we talk about, the susceptibility in the concept of the twinity. So we have the 2 points of the nanotech, and then they converge with the 2 points of the picotech, and then they explode into the 2 points of the star tech. So we're going through the twinity of the nanotech and the twinity of the GANS tech to understand that all of these steps involve other fields, which are going through the same process. But there has to be a connection. There has to be something that allows this to work. So we're looking at the polyatomic inertia gradients, where you have one field balanced off by another field, balanced off by another field, and so on and so on and so on. And then in terms of physicality, that becomes a chain link. But in terms of the plasma state, there becomes a bond, a polyatomic plasmatic bond. So how does this work? Well, when we're looking at the dynamic plasma relationships, we can't just look at that horizontal transmission, which creates our body, or that vertical transition, which creates our polar emission. That's the difference between that Earth space point within and that Earth space field. So on top of that, we have charges that are going around our basic structure. We call it the radiance, the vertical emission. But we have a feeding radiance and a feedback radiance. So understand this comes from the gravitational plasma in the core. So which means that there's a magnetical plasma that's floating around. And this magnetical plasma is always magnetical because it's on the outside related to the gravitational core. However, it is moving. So that means the magnetical plasma at one point is magnetical, and when it moves to another point, it moves to a gravitational point. So in that movement, it has to maintain its maggrav position. But it is moving from one point to another point. And it can only do that if there's a gradient. And so it doesn't mean just one atom, because we are complex. It becomes polyatomic. And so this movement causes a transitioning. So we can say stay on the same energy state, or we can transfer from one energy state to another energy state. So we can go higher, we can go lower. It all depends on the gradient. And so this represents the polyatomic gradient transitioning. So when we look at the carbon inertia highways that we talk about, the transmission, the transition, and the transmutation, hey, that's there's something in the back there. And then we look at what's in the back and it's, well, wait a second, there's something else there as well. So we find that from what we see, there's what we don't see. And from what we don't see, there's what we see. But what we see and what we don't see is also a maggrav condition. So we have to understand that what we see is only half the picture. Sometimes we see both halves, but sometimes we only see one half. The fact of the matter is that in order to have an existence, you have to have a maggrav condition. That's a magnetical gravitational balance. And depending on the gradient, it tells you at which level you're operating at. So when you're operating at an extreme on one, you'd be operating at an extreme on the other. So it's like, being in the eye of the hurricane. It's very calm, maybe on the inside, very calm on the inside, but on the periphery, it's wild, right? And so we find that our perception of what's going on is restricted to words and hierarchy. We have this false detachment. Oh, everything's just fine. And we live in a holographic universe where we think what we see is what we get. So that is our awareness, our present point of view. But there is an ancestral point of view. And we don't have to go through the hurricane. We can simply transmute. So we find that the rate of transmission of energy is the gradient between the emotion of presence and the presence of physicality. So the feeding is specific to the soul intention, and the feedback is specific to the environment. So when we look at the relationships of these cups, we have to take into account this environment we call Earth. So there's a cup of the earth, and that interacts with the cup of the soul. And that creates another inertia field where the soul of our physicality operates. So there's a connection to the soul, and there's a connection to the environment. And we are polyatomic, and we have many gradients. So we can see on the 603rd Knowledge Seekers Workshop, the vertical alignment, what we call that path link that goes from the soul to that physicality, but there's that intermediate step, the soul of the physicality. And so we can say, well, there's an infinity loop. There's a balance on one side, on the soul side. There's a balance on the other side, the physical side. And it's the soul of physicality which manipulates the gradient. And so we can change those field representations. But there's another inertia field emission. And this allows us to cross that threshold that limits us to our physicality. It allows us to engage with other environments in other plasma fields. So when we're looking at this susceptibility gradient, we talked about the chain link, which is the physicality, which is atomic. The soul of physicality is monatomic. The soul itself is diatomic. And humanity is polyatomic. And it operates via path link. These are the polyatomic gradient transitioning levels. And each one is governed by the three dimensions coming together of the X, Y, and Z axis representing the transition matter, say, on one field that is negative, or the X, Y, and Z axis, three dimensions on another field, which is the transition matter, which is positive. So the negative and positive coming together gives you that single track, that transfer state. We call it the negative positive junction. And from there, you can work on a rotating field or on a polar field. And this all has to do and is manifesting by your attention. So you have to have unity within the community, or you have to have unity within your inner space. In order to succeed at that, you have to understand that there's a mental and physical bonding, a soul and consciousness bonding, an energy and intention bonding, an energy and intention bonding. In other words, two fields coming together with a bond. So we have this progression going from that nano point, which is going towards density, and that pico point, which is even more gravitational, and then towards that GANS point, which is gaseous, and it actually is a plasma point that is highly magnetical. So the difference is one is power drawing, the gravitational intensity, and one is power providing, the magnetical intensity, and it follows the laws of conservation of energy. The conservation of the maggrav, where you have the maggrav on one side, the maggrav on the other side, and these fields are balanced always, regardless of which energy state. So energy is portable. So energy can go through different states of transition. We call elevation, where the physical matter can go to the energy state, or we call it inertia, where the energy state can go to the physical matter state. Both work at the same time. So elevation involves expansion. And so this is what we're talking about, the polyatomic GANS tech. And we see the manifestation of all the periodic table of elements, and each one has its own mass, and each one has its own structure. So going back to the universal creation of matter, these are all part of the nuclear feeding inertia, and each part is a fragment of the complexity. Each one is gravitationally stable, and each one has the portability of the dimensions. to various dimension points. And so you have the three fields coming together, but you have a product, an inertia product, and that becomes susceptible to the gravitational intensity feedback, which we call attraction, or the magnetical outintensity feeding, which we call repulsion. And so one is the electron and one is the neutron. And I'm sure you can see the difference. So when we talk about the undifferentiated beginning, the neutron came before the atom, but there was a deficiency. So the atom, which is uncut, was cut into the electron and the proton. So the mass is not balanced. Something was missing, and that becomes the PM tick. So if we look at the neutron, it has a magnetical gravitational relationship which maintains its existence. If we look at the atom, it has an electron, magnetical, proton, gravitational, which maintains its existence. If we look at the PM tick, it has a magnetical gravitational relationship which maintains its existence. If we look at the combination of the PM tick, which is magnetical, and the atom, which is gravitational, the balance of these two balance the neutron. So therefore, when we say you come from the darkness, that's within, or you want to be from the light, that's without, and the two balance. So the principal matter is the PM tick because it's magnetical. It's an energy pack that comes together to this plasmagen conversion, the coming together of the antimatter, dark matter, and mattergen. And then it interacts with the inertia field of the Earth and creates a new inertia field, which is our magnetical gravitational physical body. It all comes from the plasma, not the other way around, the way we're accustomed to it. And so this plasma has to maintain a gravitational magnetical relationship. And then at that point in time, it can create a field, develop the strength, and create a soul. And at that point, it can create a structure. And at that point, it can create a GANS field. And then we have this gravitational conformation. We have the hydrogen coming together in pairs. And it shows us with an emission spectrum that is here. It's a unique fingerprint. And we can always see the animate objects because they are always emitting, whether there is light or there is no light. That's why with night vision, we can see the animate objects because they are emitting. So we're always emitting. Our aura is emitting. And so our point of awareness is every color. But our auras represent some specific color. And our physical interpretation is that there is no color. But there's always an emission. And this is all contained under the peace dome. Because that's how the universe works. And that's why with oxygen, we have another gravitational conformation. So when the oxygen and the hydrogen come together, this is the universal solvent of life on this planet. It's not a conflict point. It's a binding zone. And that's what's our gravitational conformation, allowing us to cross that threshold between the magnetical fields of the universe and the magnetical fields of the Earth. because these are like poles that repel. How do we cross that barrier? The one magnetical field has to be attracted to the other's gravitational field. That's why. So one is from without, one is from within. And then the one is opposite and connects the same way. And both of these fields operate on one track. It's a two-way street. And so we see these seeds that form. And we say, oh, well, I have this one seed. How does it manifest? That GANS in the core is emitted magnetically on all points, all 4 points of the star. And from there, it creates a magnetical gravitational field, a MAGRAV condition, which begins that dimension star formation. So this all transpires into a MAGRAV singularity point of view. There's a soul point of view and a soul of physicality point of view. And there's a threshold of awareness which we can cross and understand the proper physical interpretation, which then becomes the collective point of awareness. And it's at that point where the many points coming together, just like on the GANS popcorn, this becomes highly gravitational. And at that point in time, it can do and exchange a lot more. It can be more and do more. So we understand better the Peace Dome reactor, how it works. On the one hand, it's a shield. That's a dimension point. On the other hand, it's a star position. That's another dimension point. These are two gradients, and there's a relationship that becomes the point of possession. That becomes another dimension point. And so we've been able to put our finger on that and connect the dots, because what we're trying to do is to take this plasma science and create these practical points, understanding practical reasoning. So to take that road to self-determination, or the road from self-determination, it involves a practical philosophy and practical solutions. So the practical currency of life is the currency of the creator, the exchange of energy unconditionally. So there's a giving and there's a taking, and we're all experiencing this shimmering awareness where we understand that there's an earth space and then there's our inner space. That is a MAGRAV relationship. And on book number 3, we see man's universe and the sister universe. That is a MAGRAV relationship. So extend that to the relationship between the universe and the unicos, and that is a MAGRAV relationship. So we can see that these human inertia GANS shielding points that come together to shield us from hostiles and from aggression and from environmental harm and from fear mongering and from emotional abuse. Highly effective. And they work on a polyatomic basis. So are we concerned with this artificial awareness? The artificial intelligence is giving us rapid generational learning from a generational point of view. And so from that point of view, we have a rapid historic generational learning as well. But we are on the threshold of transgenerational awareness, tapped into the teachings of the Creator. And so this supplementation that we're looking for, which is due to consumption, comes through acquired knowledge. But that knowledge is a conditional teaching by ancient teachers. What we're looking for is that unconditional teaching by the Creator. So this is a new awareness. And this historical threshold between the cosmic feeding and deluge harvesting is the kind of supplementation that we're looking for, because we see humanity's cross as a burden, but truly it's humanity's crossing the threshold of the connection between the soul and the physicality. That is the soul of physicality and the converging us together through this polyatomic structure. So our awareness integration is giving us this manifestation by the Creator. And we compare that to the manifestation by humanity. So we understand that we need to be self-sufficient with our body, mind, and energy coming together. We need to be strong, united, and focused, and sovereign, because that is the image of the Creator, the bringing together of these polyatomic fields. So we seem to be going into this uncharted territory. But this is a range from decay to radiation. We are that technology. We are that inertia product. And we are the image of our dimensional convergence point. The best food for us is the soul food. So let's tune into that, plug into the Creator, turn on to that power and drop out of the resistance. Receive that inertia point. To be effective, you have to provide the pattern. That's how you get the energy. So you have a say in that. And we've been trying to teach that for 607 weeks in a row through the Knowledge Seekers workshops. So it appears that to achieve that greater oneness, we have to subtly transcend the limitations of nuclear science. Not the limitations of the science, the limitations of the understanding of the science. Because now the new research teams know that we can go from the nanotech, which are diamonds, to the gold of the GANS production. And we are in the post-May the 10th of 2025 era where we can create gold by the tons. And we need many research teams to develop the technology in a practical application further. And one of the ways to transmit this energy is to communicate through the One Nation networks. This is all part of the technology release, because it's hard to sleep when our beds are burning. We need a rescue on all the fronts, the scientific, financial, political. All of these fulfill our preservation needs, but we need to be rescued from our consumption, and we need to be rescued on our mission to do creation. And so this is all part of the transmutation testing that we've been doing for several years. And we have another one coming up in September. This is the latest, the most advanced. It's incorporating many more fields. It's amalgamating the 3 books. 1 + 1 + 1 gives us 3, and we're none of those 3. We're part of a 4th fallen dimension, maybe, and there may be more, because we are polyatomic. Our mission is to bring peace on earth and join humanity with the universal community. We want to bring man as equal to all the beings in the universe by teaching the plasma science and technology equally to everyone, that no one is left out and no one is abused due to the lack of knowledge. So help us achieve this goal, because you cannot extricate yourself from the universal community. This is the Keshe Foundation Spaceship Institute teachings on plasma science, so welcoming all the beautiful knowledge seekers of the carbon nations, learning about the new selection process of the new organic plasma science. It's a World Peace Treaty. Choose it, sign it unconditionally, and mean it sincerely. The point of the true GANS tech is to cross polyatomic boundaries. The peace dome of outer space can be your guiding beacon. That's the only way that we can get into outer space. So is the inertia of the present governed by dimensions of history? Well, it's time to learn the history of the self in a universal context. The GANS is a peaceful superconductor of true intentions, and these GANS explosions cross polyatomic barriers. Our gravitational confirmation is the proof. We need to cross those barriers between our belief and our experience. And the plasma science needs to continue to be delivered daily via the Peace Dome in a practical exchange for peace on Earth. So welcome to the new golden outer space age. And please feel free to join us, because this is the way to peace and prosperity. Hope you all enjoyed the trip today.
Thank you, Alex. And again, I was just thinking, man is the only creature in the universe to have this emotion of greed. This is a real blooper on behalf of the creator, I guess. That only man has come into this sort of greed, but as he said, we can transfer it to the others too. So this is a real shortage of fields, even though there's so much beauty and beauty in the matter state. As he said, you don't think the creator makes mistakes. It's called mankind. So this is what they're starting to process out, and I think it'll balance many things out on this planet if the greed is eliminated. You certainly won't have the need. But let's go to our participants and see if any have any questions. Thank you, Alex, again. Would anyone like to raise a point? And of course, the beauty of it is it's getting processed out as we speak, I think. As Mr. Kesh indicated, look at yourselves in the next days and weeks and months and see what has changed.
So I put a little chart in the chat group that, we're basically walking Kohan, 65% oxygen, 18.5% carbon, 9.5% hydrogen, 2.2% nitrogen, all the other things. So as Alex said, we're walking plasma reactors. So the thing with all the beautiful charts Mr. Kesh has been showing us that we're doing in the energy state, in the universal plasma state, we're learning the human body is more than just flesh and blood, aren't we?
A beautiful reactor built by the creator himself. But apparently it still needs a bit of correction or enlightenment.
Well, let's just call it good maintenance.
Yeah. I think somebody else wanted to say something. Go right ahead.
Hello, everyone.
Yes, go ahead.
I listened this week. It's not from the Cash Foundation, but I'd like to discuss because the guy was explaining that we don't have only 118 elements in the periodic table. We have 144, and the differences of these elements is not visible. It's energy. Do you know something about that, Alex?
Oh, well, one of the things I do know is that there are other elements in the universe that are not present on Earth. So that does take off the top limit. The other thing is that many of the elements that are at the higher end of the periodic table are in as isotopes. So they're more in the they're very unstable in terms of their physicality. Sometimes you have to see something that is there, not by its presence, but by its absence. So when scientists are looking at something and they can't explain it, it means that there's something impacting their observation, but they can't see what it is that is impacting. And the way we interpret the scientific information in the scientific community, it has to be verified and validated by man-made means. This is highly restrictive because it implies that the universe is man-made. And of course, that is patently false. Actually, it's not even patented, it's false. The thing is that to put that kind of restriction is that feedback dominant point of view. And what you've just said is that it appears that other scientists are showing that there are other elements that are not represented on the periodic table of elements. And we shouldn't be surprised at this because all of the elements on the periodic table of elements came together as a result. So we did not go through these elements numerically, even though they seem to be sorted out numerically. So we found one element that has a certain mass, and so we applied an atomic number based on the number of protons, and then we had gaps. So once we established the fact that there was a sequence, so if you say that, well, numbers, it's just like throwing numbers on the table. If you start to realize, well, there's a sequence, 1, 2, 5, 6, 7, 8. Oh, 1, 2, 5. Oh, so 3 and 4 are missing. Well, if you understand that 3 and 4 are missing, then you're going to go look for that. If you don't know that they're missing, then you're going to say, oh, well, I know how to count 1, 2, 5, 6, 7. Wait a second. You're not counting properly. And then if you become stubborn and say, well, that's all I have. And you say, well, what about 3 and 4? Well, I don't have that. So you disavow that. You fail to acknowledge its existence. You just kind of like write it off. Well, we've now come to the point where many scientists are wanting to find if there are more elements, because if, and you said the number 118, I think, so that means, why is 118 the highest number? Is it the highest number? Could there not be a 119? And if there could be a 119, maybe there could be a 120. Is it possible that someone discovered this 144 and they said, oh, you know what? Between 118 and 144, there's a lot of numbers missing. These also could be elements. So maybe we should start looking for them. So this is how the science is evolving. The fact of the matter is that in order for science to take into account and still abide by its limitations, that is to say, verification and validation by man-made means, that may not be possible. And we know that is true because we're still having trouble understanding how babies are born. And it's more than just a glint in daddy's eye, isn't it? So
Yes.
we have to take more into account. And at some point in time, we're going to have to say, well, you know what? You've put limitations on our knowledge, and we don't need those limitations. And then we find that there are those who are insisting on keeping those limitations. And that introduces a whole new aspect. And you say, well, in the interest of science, you wouldn't have those limitations. So the implementation of those limitations, therefore, would not be in the interest of science. What interest is it? So now we've introduced a new question. And regardless of whether or not how many elements, if 118 is the largest or 144 is the largest number, regardless, we now know that there are artificial limitations. That is the artificial intelligence. The real intelligence is coming from the creator, and we need to patch into that. So it's an excellent point you brought up. Thank you.
Right,
Thank
and
you.
as Mr. Kesh pointed out to us, that table of elements, as we start to explore space, will grow into the upper 4-digit numbers. And as he also showed, we don't even have to go out into space to mine them. We can create them right here, as he showed, creating things that they're not even sure what they are so far in the material end. But that periodic table will grow into the upper 4 digits, as I understand it. And this will give us many more toys in a way to sort of play with. And I put something in there. How can Mr. Kesh state Iran is 50 years ahead of the rest of the world in nano coding? How do you interpret this statement? It must go deeper than our current basic understanding of nanomaterials. 50 years is quite a long time, and I'm glad they'll be sharing some of this knowledge with the rest of the nations. And of course, Randy put something in here about the medical that will be coming out about this tripartite cooperation agreement has been signed to advance Iran's position in plasma medicine, aiming to develop innovative healthcare technologies and improve treatment protocols. Randy, do you want to add anything? How did you come across that? But I know the pharmaceuticals, as has been explained to us, they're well aware of the plasma medicine. They already have a name for it. They're going to call it plasmaceuticals, if I'm correct on that. I know Mr. Kesh had mentioned that in the past, and this is some of these energies, as we showed in Keeping the Kesh Foundation Free, melting kidney stones from 10,000 kilometers away, and other things. And everyone wants to obviously be more healthy for the most part, even maybe they don't know how to achieve it. I think these energies will change some of the positions within us, again, just by introducing a different energy. Anyone else have a thought or a question they'd like to share? So what about this? I guess nanomaterials, they're not all made the same, or there's a much deeper understanding of this, Alex? 50 years, as I said, is quite a long time.
Well, it's an arbitrary number, isn't it? Because it only refers to the number of times the Earth goes around the sun. The point being is that when we're talking about orders of magnitude, so that's 10 times. So if if you're making a physical advancement you'd be moving 1 year. And if you're making a plasmatic advancement, then you'd be moving 10 years. So it stands to reason that if you're looking at a practical application, from the time you go from the design or the concept to the manufacture of a physical item, it might take 5 years. But if you're going to do it plasmatically and you're going to insist on doing it physically, then it is going to take you a long time. Now, 50 years sounds like a long time, but many of us who've now grown to that ripe old age of oldness, it's over 50 years. And I never thought that in 50 years we would have, I'm going to say, disappointing progress, because I remember how excited I was as a teenager, and this is a fact. We had announced from the University of Toronto on the front page of the Toronto Daily Star the flat screen TV invention. I was 16 at the time. That was over 50 years ago. It took us, I'm going to say, about 40 years to get that into the mainstream. Now when you go into the electronics store to buy a screen, they're all flat screen TVs, aren't they? They're all flat screen monitors. It took over 50 years to get that into the mainstream. It seems like an unusually long time, but you have to ask yourself a question as to why. And one of those reasons why is because the people who are making the regular cathode ray tubes did not want that to come.
Yeah.
So the desire of a few restricted the desire of many. And that's just not right. That's what happens if you're talking about orders of magnitude. So the desire of a few is also a lower field strength. The desire of many is a higher field strength. So we need to understand that we're all in this boat together, and so deciding to each go in our individual ways is part of the divide and conquer mantra, and we need to work together. So it's kind of interesting the way Mr. Kesh is conducting his life now. He's suggesting that you won't find a signature on any bank account with his name on it.
With dollar holdings, I think he specifically said.
Yeah. So wrap your head around that one if you can. There's no rule that says, it has to be 50 years. It's if we continue on that trajectory where we are physically dominant, then it's going to take that long. But do we have that, shall we say, do we have that grace period? It appears not, because there are a few who are quite unhappy with this situation. And as confounding as it is as to why this is happening, it is happening, and we have to be, aware of that happening, and basically we have to figure out how we can do this. And so clearly, the physical way is the slowest way, and the plasmatic way is the fastest way. So we have to decide which network we're going to operate on, the slow one or the fast one. And now we have a choice because that technology is in the hands of humanity. When you look at the historical situation, this should be easy to understand. As you know, that the bombing in Hiroshima was the first man-made atomic bomb. It was not the first atomic bomb. So it seems to be that we have a new man-made solution, a first, at hand. It also seems to be the first solution at hand, notwithstanding the solution from the creator. It's actually quite an achievement, wouldn't you say?
Yes, and this is one of the shortcomings of the West, apparently, because, you know, if I was building these tube televisions and I built a factory and I borrowed some money from the bank and the rest of this, I certainly don't want to see a new technology come in because I have to pay the bank wants its money back. And the only way I can pay it back is to sell more of the tube televisions. So I think this is one of the one thing that will hold the West back in a way, that these systems, the ones that own it, seem to want to make sure they're fully paid for before they switch to a new technology. So the Eastern countries are not in that predicament as deeply. And I think they'll be more open to bringing the technology in and may even have a head start on us.
Well, yes, but we have to remember that the technological innovation was motivated usually by military activity. So it behooved the military to incorporate advanced technology in order to win on the battlefield. Well, we've come to that point now where mutually assured destruction cannot be mistaken for winning. And so that method of measuring our success is actually fundamentally obsolete, and it's a man-made obsolescence, isn't it? Because, you know, we've come to the point of mutually self-assured destruction. It's in fact, it's automated, so there is no winning a nuclear holocaust. The notion of winning is how shall we say, is a false notion. So if we continue in that path, then we are assured to fail. So if you know that, why do you continue in that regard? That becomes the ultimate question. So we can no longer be bystanders and let that happen. Through the practical application of the technology, it enables each of us to participate in the solution. So every one of us that participates in that solution, we become one less problem.
Another question in the chat: does it take a long time to become a master of these understandings? Maybe shorter with the use of the cosmic ray technology, transfer of knowledge or enlightenment. And this is what I think is happening in the background. We are being enlightened as a gift in a way from the creator. So in the matter state, yes, I think it does take a long time. But on the other hand, even the creator is still learning. So do we ever reach a full understanding?
So this is a very good question, and I've asked myself this question because It's kind of front and center for all of us right now. There was a time that a lot of people, let's say, for instance, one addiction, some people want to quit is smoking. And in my case, I quit smoking 4 days before New Year's. And so I went to a New Year's party, and it was really strange. Everybody there was smoking 1 and 2 cigarettes at a time, and exclaiming how they were going to quit in the morning, as part of the New Year's resolution. And when they found out that I had quit smoking 4 days prior to the New Year's party, they said, well, wait a second, that's not the way we do things. You know, if we're going to make a New Year's resolution, then the threshold for smoking and not smoking is going to be, New Year's, right? So, at around 11 o'clock, people are huffing and puffing on their cigarettes, so, assuming that after midnight that they will stop smoking, or at the very least, they'll extend it to the morning, the morning after, right? And when I look at how I quit smoking, I quit cold turkey, and how I was able to do that was because I made a promise to myself. And when you make a promise to yourself, it's hard to cheat. Oh, because that means that your promise has no sincerity, right? If you make a promise, then the true intention is to keep that promise. And if you're trying to fool somebody and you hide behind that, veil of deceit, you think you can get away with it. But there is no veil of deceit for when you're promising to yourself. So, what's the point of making a promise then? So I made a promise and I kept it. And I did, and I'm really glad that I did. Because at that time, the price of cigarettes was going to go to over $2 a package. And, I think it's pushing $15 a package or even more now today. I don't know. So that just goes to show you. But now the question to me comes, am I going to be able to quit eating cold turkey? Can I do the same thing? I'm confronted with that every day. And, at least in the last 2 years, and I know, I know your story, Mark, you've been telling us publicly often, we've all cut down on how much we eat, but, we still eat. So when will we cross that final threshold and do that? And how long is it going to take? Are we going to have to do it cold turkey, or can we do it gradually? I don't have the answer to that. What do you think, Mark?
Well, it's hard to say, but I think if the energies are in the environment and your lymph is absorbing them, you'll be surprised that you're just not hungry. And as that process continues, even if you do eat, it would seem like the amount is reduced. I know for sure I was thinking about waste in the landfills. I'm not taking out my recycling can or the garbage can maybe now once every 3 weeks, sometimes 4 weeks. So that's a good sign that I've reduced in a way, as he said with the gold. Or are you heading more towards the creator, or are you heading more towards the physicality? And skipping a meal or 2 meals a day, I think, is heading closer to the creator. It's not completed, but it's a process. And I think most of these are processes rather than instant switching off. As he said, you could stop eating, but at the same time, you need to know how to absorb more energies, you can't just stop eating. Or energy.
Right. So you don't want to tie that to the calendar and say, well, okay, we're in the month of September, New Year's is coming. Maybe I'll target, New Year's Day, and then, there you are at the New Year's Eve party munching on potato chips, and when the clock strikes midnight, you're going to have to stop eating. That's
Nothing like I don't want it to be a complex or a painful process, anything like that. So we'll just let it take its course.
You'd have to fight off the munchies.
But we're still sticking with it. And I think it will grow. And as Mr. Kesh said, when the Indians and the Pakistanis were the same, and then they separated and one took a different energy than the other, and this is what we'll see. Our physical structure will change over the course of the next century or so, without a doubt, as these energies are introduced, rather than the killing, because this is the whole idea of moving away from taking or stealing. As Takesh said, I don't call it killing, I call it stealing others' energies to sustain your own, and this practice will more and more fade away, even to the point in the future where people will frown. You know how someone lights up a cigar in a room and everybody goes, oh. So I think in the future, more and more people will start to frown on people that actually eat. I think that was voiced to us through Mr. Kesh.
Well, that was how I quit cold turkey, because I didn't stop with the first person complaining about smoking. There was a gradual, shall we say, awareness coming across the society, where they were discussing this openly. And so that concept came into play. And then once I was ready, then I was able to quit. So yeah, you're absolutely right. So here we are, discussing this concept. So I think once we have an environment that is more conducive to that, it will make that transition easier for us. And this 20% deficiency allocated towards consumption, it's a big gap. So, would it be possible for us to reduce that gap? Would this be proper thinking? Could we reduce that gap to, say, 15% deficiency and then maybe 10%? Could we do this?
Absolutely.
And
You said we're feeding you the 80 and the 20% today in the last workshop.
no, I realize that, but I mean, uh, in order to maintain a consistency and a continuity, and the only way that I can rationalize this is through the drug addiction. If you remember the first Parkinson's reversal, it took 8 weeks to reverse the Parkinson's, but it took another 10 weeks to get over the drug addiction. The gentleman was taking over 24 drugs as a drug cocktail, and so it took 10 weeks to slowly wean him off, which is what we were talking about earlier today with respect to that singular network, the turning on and the turning off, right? So if we're going to remove the external drug supplementation, then we had to replace that with the internal supplementation of whatever those drugs were trying to replace. So in other words, we have to re-engage our internal capability. So the drugs were causing us to lose the service of our capability. When we quit the drugs, we had to activate the service of our capability, right? So you can't just turn it on. It isn't like a tap and you say, okay, well, uh, I now will turn on this capability when the body is not conditioned. The thing about the body is that it takes time for the body to heal. So we've noticed that with the transmutation training, at least I've noticed it, the soul can react instantaneously, but the physical body lags behind. And, in my own particular case, I have seen reactions sometimes delay 4 or 5 days after a transmutation session. So that just goes to show you that the physical manifestation of the benefits have a delayed result. And as long as I don't put a time limit on it, and then all of a sudden I turn, oh, I'm feeling better this way, or I'm noticing something has changed this way. But because of the lag between the number of days, we forget the connection. And for a lot of people, this is a matter of convenience. Say, well, I did this process, and then a week later I got a reaction, and you don't tie the two together. But now we are becoming more observant, and we're saying, okay, well, I went to the transmutation test on Friday. What's my viewpoint on Monday? And is it connected? Oh, yes, it is. And we can see that now. And I think all the knowledge seekers are seeing that connection. So it's all part of our awareness. Once that awareness becomes activated in that regard, then we start to extend that to other fields of interest. And that's what's going to accelerate the transition, the paradigm shift, if you will. Back to you, Mark.
Right, just like the cars, if the car has no gas, it doesn't run. And we could never imagine running a car without petrol. And we haven't imagined that we can run our system ourselves without eating, or with less eating, perhaps. And this is a definite, it's definitely on the card, and it's definitely being shown. Slowly, step by step, they'll introduce more of these energies into the planet that the lymph will pick it up without having to pick it up through the digestive system. This is the way I'm seeing it.
Well, from my point of view, I don't understand why the governments around the world are not rushing, to that technology. Because if I were to list the pros and cons of, advancing in that regard, it's a no contest. So it defies logic, which means that there is another reason. It's not a logical reason in terms of the technology, but it's a logical reason with respect to why the resistance is there. So this is now what we have to take into account. It is no longer adequate enough to say, okay, well, we have the technology, you know.
Because they're using it to cause mayhem in many places around the world. The shipment or lack of shipment of grains and other things, we can use that to cause chaos in your country. So they don't want to, at this point, feed everybody through the fields. That takes away one of their arms, in a way, of control.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. So if we want peace and prosperity on this planet, we have to recognize that we're part of it. We can't extricate ourselves from it. So the intention has to come first, and that has to be spread across the entire population. So everybody has to admit that they are actually hoping to get peace and prosperity. Once the critical mass is achieved, then that field becomes more influential. And that's what we want to do. So thanks to all the knowledge seekers for participating in that. And I just want to take this opportunity to thank everybody for allowing me to continue to present. We need to keep this going if we want to fulfill our goals and aspirations. Please carry on, Mark.
Okay, you brought up book number 2, The Structure of the Light, correct? And I put
Yes.
a question in there. How do we understand light as a particle or light as a photon? Are they the same? I remember Mr. Kesh saying you can see the light as a photon or you can see it as a particle. I always thought of particles of being a field or matter state, but made up of a field. Any light you'd like to shed on this question?
Well, yeah, the particle is like a PM tick. It's an energy pack. So, as that energy pack is coming, it adds to it. So, if you think of the field as a warehouse and then someone is delivering a package, that package gets transferred from the transport vehicle into the warehouse. So that would be a particle. Well, the light itself is both the transport vehicle and the particle. It has a duality. And one aspect of it, of the light, is visible. And in the position of being visible, it has additionally a characteristic of heat. And as such, it has a characteristic of frequency. Light in a plasma state does not have heat, does not have frequency, and is not visible. So at that point, it is what we call a photon. So it's an energy pack, but it's not visible, it's not physical, so it can't be a particle. So therefore, when we're looking at the difference between the matter state, the exclusive plasma state, the light has to have a certain kind of energy to operate in that level. When we are looking at the plasma matter state, then the light has to have a nearness and proximity to the physicality. And then the next step down is the inertia field, the engagement of the light with the inertia of the planet, the environment. And then it steps down in energy and actually becomes visible in its physicality. So the way the light manifests into the physical matter state is the same way that the Earth's GANSes have manifested into the elements of this planet, and it's the same way that we were born. We were born from energy and manifest into physicality. It's all the same.
Okay. Anyone else want to raise a point or a question? Thank you, Alex. All right, I'm not hearing any further responses, so perhaps we're satisfied today. Go ahead. I see you've changed the screen.
As you know, our generation can't get no satisfaction.
Well, I don't know. It seems like everyone is going to become more and more satisfied as the weeks and the months move ahead. Again, we may go through a rough period, but we'll come out, I think, more satisfied as a result of that whole process, if it happens. Perhaps that's the turning point. Gee, that's been, hasn't that been in the news lately with this Charlie Kirk turning point?
Oh, I don't want to go there.
No problem. All right, anyone else want to bring anything up before we end the session? I want to thank everyone for being here. Again, we're all carrying a very small corner of a huge, huge carpet, but we're in the process of that expanding as well as more and more people get touched by this knowledge and they become a bit more enlightened. This whole process will congeal into that one nation, one planet, one race for world peace.